Afghanistan has been in the news this week following a complete takeover by the Taliban armed group. I've talked about this before on the channel, looking at the American plan to withdraw and being skeptical about the process, and now it seems that our worst fears have come true, as the Taliban, starting in early May, launched an offensive that soon gained ground, and by early August they'd taken over the majority of the country. Then they attacked the provincial capitals, and finally they surrounded and captured Kabul on the 15th of August. This came after a 2-decade-long military presence of what many consider to be the best armed forces in the world, that of the United States, as well as many international allies, including NATO. It's cost around $1 trillion, much of which has been put into the armed forces, but also into the establishment of a civilian government in Afghanistan. And yet, with the withdrawal of a large amount of these forces, at the first sign of a Taliban offensive, it crumbled and has fallen, and the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, controlled by the Taliban, has been declared. And what took around 100,000 Afghan lives, thousands of international soldiers' lives, around $1 trillion, and 2 decades to create and to protect, was lost in the space of only 3 months. The question on everyone's lips is, how has this happened? For a quick introduction into who the Taliban are and what their origins are, then do check out my video on the Taliban, the 5-minute history. Although in this video I want to focus more on what happened from September of 2020, as I think the current fall of Afghanistan can be linked directly to the United States peace deal that was signed with the Taliban in Doha in 2020, and which I made an earlier video about as well. What's important to remember about this deal is that it was made by the Trump administration at the time, so the United States, and representatives of the Taliban. It did not include the Afghan government in any way, shape or form, and many members of that government were highly critical of the deal that had been signed. The deal stipulated the conditions upon which the Americans would leave Afghanistan completely. In exchange, the Americans released 5,000 Taliban prisoners that were being kept in Afghan prisons. This led to many experts, often seasoned battle commanders, being handed over to the Taliban on the vague promise of the Taliban to reduce their violence and not to target American personnel in Afghanistan, the second of which they did, the first of which they certainly did not. The effect of releasing what were often very experienced soldiers back to the Taliban is that it greatly reinforced not only their numbers but also their capability and the experience in their ranks. Furthermore, it was an incredible morale booster for the Taliban and was widely criticized by the Afghan military and Afghan politicians, who were continually seen as being inept and not able to deal with the Taliban. It also served in a large part to legitimize the Taliban, as the Americans had dealt directly with spokesmen from their organization and had completely sidelined the Afghan government, which had been made to look inept in the wake of an agreement between what was a world superpower and essentially an armed Islamist militia. On the 1st of May 2021, the date that American soldiers were supposed to leave Afghanistan, the Taliban started their offensive in the country. However, the Americans, instead of backing down on their side of the deal and refusing to leave, decided to continue with the withdrawal of US soldiers, which they said would be complete by the historic date of the 11th of September. But it was far from a foregone conclusion. After all, the Taliban offensive would be against the Afghan armed forces that had been trained and funded by the Americans and other NATO powers for around 20 years. They numbered around 350,000 strong and were armed with the best equipment available to them, whereas the Taliban were often in the back of Toyotas with Kalashnikovs and some basic machine guns, without the military training and expertise of the United States, and only numbered around 70,000 men. So then, how did it go so wrong for the Afghan army? The frequently cited figure that the Afghan National Army was made up of 350,000 men needs to be reanalyzed, as a large part of this number isn't actually of the armed forces but rather of police forces and other law enforcement agencies rather than the actual army itself. And in fact, of that number, only around 185,000 belonged to an effectively equipped armed force that could put up a fight against the Taliban. Of this number, it's estimated that only around 60% had received their full basic training by the time of the Taliban offensive, and this is for reasons that I'll get into in just a moment. There's also a very large problem with ghost battalions in the Afghan National Army.
Not missing, just hiding in the paperwork.
These occur when battalions are ordered to be raised to bolster the national defense, but instead the commanders simply pocket the money that is meant to be assigned to paying soldiers' salaries and equipment for themselves, and so these troops don't exist either, even though they do exist in the paperwork. Corruption of this kind is incredibly common through all levels of what is now the former Afghan government, and this has certainly played an important role in the downfall and the weakness of the Afghan armed forces in the face of this recent Taliban assault. This also played into the fact that a lot of the equipment that was meant to go to these Afghan soldiers, very high-tech American equipment that should have given them a great edge over the Taliban, was actually sold onto the black market both by soldiers themselves, but more frequently by commanders who would turn a profit. And of course, who are the ones that are buying these weapons and equipment on the Afghan black market? None other than the Taliban themselves. And so all that American money and equipment and weapons and ammunition that meant to be going to stopping the Taliban actually ended up in their hands before they'd even captured a single district from the Afghans they were fighting. And these problems were only exacerbated by the American withdrawal. Initially, it had been the Pentagon's responsibility to directly pay the wages of the Afghan National Army's soldiers. However, with the American withdrawal, this responsibility was shifted to the government in Kabul, and lo and behold, the salaries of the soldiers didn't arrive into, well, it's probably not their bank accounts, but into their pockets. They were siphoned off by politicians and army commanders higher up the line. Of course, this does nothing for the morale when the pay doesn't come in. But it wasn't only pay that didn't make it out to the Afghan National Army soldiers at their outposts and in their barracks. At times it was even the very ammunition that they needed to fight back against the Taliban, and they were complaining of being desperately short of ammunition. Part of this again goes back to the black market, and others are failures in the logistics of the Afghan system as the United States pulled out. They also often lacked food as they were unable to get supplies to forward bases. The reasons why I will explain in just a second, but this all led to a worsening morale among the Afghan National Army soldiers and a feeling that they were not being protected and supplied for by the government in Kabul due to the rampant corruption that was happening at all levels of the system. Given these factors, it's no surprise to learn that desertion was a huge problem for the Afghan National Army, and that actually desertion rates were as high as 1 in 4 in the Afghan National Army's ranks over several years. While the problem has been worse since the news of the American withdrawal, these problems have actually existed in the Afghan National Army for as long as it's been around, and they have never been addressed. The low morale and frequent desertion rates in the Afghan National Army aren't only down to the poor communication systems, corruption, and failure of pay to get through to them, which has only been a problem really since the Americans started to pull out. This is something that several US commanders did indeed notice, but these problems were nonetheless not addressed. As the former US General Wesley Clark explains, the truth is that these people in Afghanistan have been through this before. This is a country that's been at war for 40 years. People signed up with the Afghan military to make money. They fired their weapons. Did they want to die in service of the Afghan military? Remember, Afghanistan is not a conventional nation. It's really tribal, and so they were earning a paycheck. Some of them didn't even get that paycheck, but they didn't sign up to fight to the death for the most part. He goes on to say, this is an old Afghan trick. They go with the winners, or at least they run away from the losers, and that's why it happens so quickly. Now, whether that could have been anticipated or not, we'll just have to wait and see. With the Americans at their side, they didn't mind fighting alongside them to earn their paycheck, or even really to keep the country out of the hands of the Taliban. But as Joe Biden said in one of his speeches, they have to want to fight, and the reason they wanted to fight was because the Americans were the winners. Without the Americans, they realized that the Afghan government was not going to be one of the winners. And that's one of the reasons why the army crumbled so quickly. And it wasn't only the Afghan National Army that felt the impact of the American announcement of withdrawal. The Afghan National Air Force, which was meant to keep the Taliban at bay by providing bombing runs and surveillance, and being able to supply more remote locations, also faced a great challenge with the American withdrawal. Not in the least because the Americans also pulled out their logistics. Initially, it was only meant to be US soldiers that were pulled out, but Biden proceeded to pull out all Americans on the ground completely, and this involved the logistics that the Afghans relied upon for a functioning air force. So while they had some of the most up-to-date Black Hawk helicopters and others from the United States that could really have made a difference fighting the Taliban, once they were broken, they didn't have the means or the skills or the technicians to repair them themselves, and so they lay on the ground and were completely useless to the Afghan Air Force. And this basically gave up their biggest advantage against the Taliban, which was that the Taliban didn't have any air power whatsoever. This could really have made a difference, but they were unable to utilize this advantage against them because of this failure in logistics with the American pullout, and because the Afghans themselves didn't have the skills required to keep it going without that American support that was sucked out of the country. A quick word from today's sponsor, Ground News. Now, as you can imagine, with a political topic like this, I ended up looking at a lot of different news sources. And the problem with the algorithms we have online is that if you click on, let's say, a left-wing take on something, it will only fill up your screen with the left-wing take. Or if you click on a right-wing one, with the right-wing take. And while that's great, they can be incredibly useful, you might want to see things from different sides of the political spectrum. Well, Ground News is an app that does just that. It shows you how a single story is covered from multiple sides of the political spectrum so that you can easily identify when there is a bias against one side or the other. The great thing is that it doesn't use your browsing history as other algorithms do, and so it won't slot you into an echo chamber. Now, what's great is that they're sponsoring this video, and so you can see every side of the different news stories, including ones about Afghanistan, which I talked about in this video and which will be linked below, by going to ground.news/Hilbert or clicking on the link in the description to download the free app. Definitely go and check it out, because if you're interested in this video and current affairs, I'm sure there'll be an awful lot more on Afghanistan to come. Then it's a really great one to look at so you don't get trapped in that same media bubble. Aside from the Afghan government and the Taliban, there is also a third source of political and military power in the form of various warlords that exist inside the country and can call up armed men to their banner. It's important to remember that Afghanistan is still essentially an incredibly tribal country, and this is at the root of a lot of what is going on at the minute, as we saw with several parts of the Afghan army that are often more loyal to their tribal association than they are to the country and sometimes to the distant capital and government in Kabul. Now, a lot of the time these warlords belong to a particular tribe and can call up men from this tribe or from a larger ethnicity to fight for their tribal or ethnic interest, which they will change depending on where that interest aligns, and this can constantly shift, as was seen during the 1990s. Now, to give an incredibly oversimplified map of the different ethnicities within Afghanistan, the largest ones in the region, one can see that there are already quite a lot on there, and all of these ethnicities are themselves split into different groups and different tribes that are often at war with one another and at war with other ethnicities in shifting alliances. And these warlords essentially make the best of this to gain power for themselves and to nominally protect the interest of their tribe or sometimes larger ethnic group. at the expense of others. Now, the Taliban are largely made up of individuals from the Pashtun majority in Afghanistan, and they also pursue a theory called Pashtunwali, which is like the culture of being a Pashtun. And so when the Taliban were in power, they often oppressed the other minorities within Afghanistan. And this is why many of the leading warlords in Afghanistan today are from the minorities that were traditionally oppressed by the Taliban. So Ismail Khan and Ahmad Massoud and Atta Muhammad Noor, these are all Tajiks, while Abdul Rashid Dostum is an Uzbek. But these often fought against one another. So, for example, Atta Muhammad Noor actually ousted Abdul Rashid Dostum, and they often fight against one another, but they did also unite to fight against the Taliban. But it's important to remember that the Taliban were only able to take power because in 1994, when these various warlords had united and driven out the Soviets, they turned their guns on one another and started the Afghan Civil War, which from 1996 the Taliban were able to seize power. In 1996, however, the Taliban didn't actually take over all of Afghanistan, and these warlords continued in part to fight back against them and became known as the Northern Alliance, controlling around 10% of Afghanistan in the very north. And in 2001, when the United States and NATO invaded, they were the key allies on the ground that aided them in doing so. But the United States and indeed the new Afghan government soon found out that they were incredibly unreliable bedfellows, and for instance in 2002, when one warlord wasn't made the governor of a particular district, he attacked the city by shelling it. So that's the kind of individuals that the warlords are. Incredibly difficult to get on with, but the early Afghan government had to rely on these warlords for regional stability, and people who were in 1999 called warlords in 2001 became governors, politicians, etc., and became part of the new government. And in fact, the first president, Hamid Karzai, was himself one of the Mujahideen who had raised money to fight against the Soviets, and was a warlord from the Kandahar region who had fought against the Taliban during the United States invasion. Another, who I've already mentioned, Abdul Rashid Dostum, became the vice president despite having a very murky record on human rights, and as I said, having fought against other warlords after the defeat of the Taliban. After 2004, however, when a lot of money had been pumped into the government and it looked a bit more stable and the Taliban seemed to be completely defeated, the reliance on these old warlords decreased, and the Afghan government took a lot of power from them in an attempt to centralize the government around Kabul, something that the United States was also incredibly in favor of. And this involved them demobilizing their small armies, as well as having to relinquish control over a lot of the financial assets of particular districts. This was, of course, taxation, as the central government in Kabul took over these responsibilities and extended its power at the cost of these warlords. But this can't be used to explain why the warlords didn't put up much of a resistance in this newest Taliban offensive, because in 2014 a lot of these militias were revived by the government as the United States started preparing to, level back their military involvement, and the Afghan government needed more men. And so there was a system in place for these militias, should they be needed, to be called upon, and indeed they were called upon now as well. Part of the blame, I think, has to go to the President Ashraf Ghani, who, unlike Hamid Karzai, had an incredibly poor relationship with the warlords, often refusing to meet them and insulting them, and not having a very good relationship and understanding that they were in fact an important element of the defense should it be needed. And although in the last week he did call a meeting of several warlords and met with them to try and raise these militias, I think this personal dislike between Ashraf Ghani and the warlords may have soured the air enough that the warlords decided not to rise up as they had done before, and as they might have done with more presidential support. The fate of these various warlords following this Taliban offensive is really quite different. Ismail Khan, for example, who was referred to as the Lion of Herat, and was in western Afghanistan, held out against the Taliban in the 1990s for a very long time and was a famed fighter against them. While he did mount a resistance in Herat in August as well, he was defeated after only a few days of fighting and has now apparently joined with the Taliban after he was captured. Although how much this was him actually being captured and going over to the Taliban side, or whether there was a pre-arranged agreement for him to do so and to maintain a certain amount of power in the region, is unknown. Because of course, for the Taliban, who are seeking to establish a government, certain regions in the north will be equally difficult for them to control, as it was for the incumbent Afghan government in 2001. And so they may also be seeking to bring warlords over to their side rather than eliminating them outright. And as we saw in the 1990s, the warlords were more than willing to switch sides when it favoured them. Abdul Rashid Dostum and Atta Muhammad Noor are traditional enemies, and it's thought that Ashraf Ghani, in some of the last days he was president, was trying to broker a peace between them, as they both were important warlords in the region of Mazar-i-Sharif, one of the most important cities in the very north of Afghanistan and the gateway to neighbouring Uzbekistan. Both were famous for their dogged resistance against the Taliban in the 1990s, although it should be noted that Dostum briefly also worked with them. And so it goes to show that actually there's not much of a moral or a cause-oriented basis to who they fight for, but again that it's largely based on situation and who the winners seem to be and how they can best hold on to their piece of land and what is best for their tribe and their ethnic group at the time. And indeed, despite all of the bravado that they showed beforehand, it came to nothing and they fled into neighbouring Uzbekistan with the fall of Mazar-i-Sharif itself. Now, why did the warlords fall so easily? Well, one explanation might be that the Afghan National Army, for the reasons already explained, just crumbled incredibly quickly, and that the warlords themselves didn't have the manpower to provide a defense for the regions they held without the Afghan National Army, and that because that was so quickly defeated or surrendered without actually fighting back against the Taliban, the warlords had no option and fled themselves. That's one option. At the same time, there is also the very real possibility that the local people upon whom they relied for their recruits and for food and for money at the same time, and also to not be sold out to the Taliban themselves, were not really looking forward to more years under the dogged rule of another warlord, as this had been a period in the 90s that had seen incredible hardship for these people, as the warlords were able to just run ragged over the population in the areas they controlled. And it's quite possible that without the support of the Afghan people, that they simply couldn't function anymore and saw that the battle was up, especially if the Taliban, who had been in these areas for many years, had established relationships with them already. There is also another possibility, and it's a bit of a conspiracy theory, and there's no real evidence for this, but potentially this has also played into it, and that is that these warlords often fall prey to foreign influence, as these foreign powers often sought to use them to fight their own proxy wars within Afghanistan and to spread their influence. And Abdul Rashid Dostum, it's not a big secret that he is indeed on the payroll of the Turkish government, and it's known that he was recently in Ankara, and quite possibly what was discussed there was the eventuality of a Taliban takeover. Turkey has not ruled out that it might recognize a Taliban-run Afghanistan in the future, and has reportedly been in contact with the militant group, which it said was a positive message. And so it is possible that Turkey anticipated what was happening. They indeed had a lot of troops on the ground as part of the NATO withdrawal, and still have many Turkish soldiers at Kabul airport helping with the evacuation of civilians there. So it's possible that they advised Dostum on the situation and that it might not be the end of his story there. And so perhaps the failure of his resistance wasn't entirely down to the brilliance of the Taliban on the battlefield. And it should also be noted that in 1996, one of the groups that was most targeted by the Taliban after they took over were the Hazara. Now, the Hazara, unlike the Taliban and most others inside the country of Afghanistan, they occupy the central north of the country, is that they are Shia Muslims, while the Taliban worship a form of Sunni Islam, as do most other Muslims. Now, the fact that they are Shia gives a natural ally to them in neighboring Iran, which is also a majority Shia country and has a very Shia government, and they indeed supported the Hazara and various warlords that were active there. However, in recent times, Iran has been incredibly positive about the Taliban takeover in the country, as of course the wider geopolitics is that the Taliban victory has weakened the United States, which is one of the great enemies of Iran. And so it's possible that Iran is also open to recognizing the Taliban in their position in Afghanistan, and there does seem to have been a rather large shift between the attitude of Iran towards the Taliban in the 1990s compared with now. We held on for as long as we could. We asked for more ammunition and reinforcement, but no one came. The situation was getting worse as the Taliban were getting closer. They are no longer using just Kalashnikov rifles, but are armed with heavy weapons and Humvees. Private Salangi, African National Army, Farah Province. On the 1st of May 2021, the Taliban started their offensive in Afghanistan. Before the offensive, they already controlled 73 of around 300 different districts in Afghanistan, and these were largely the rural, mountainous, often sparsely populated districts in the country. And as the offensive wore on, they basically captured more provinces or more districts like this. And I was following the situation quite closely and continually heard different Afghan officials saying, yes, they are making gains, but these are largely the remote and the unimportant, the sort of backwater districts that will be recaptured easily and won't give them much advantage at all. But this was completely wrong, because in fact over the years, over the 2 decades that the Taliban had been an insurgent force in Afghanistan, it was in these precise rural areas where they could lever their power over the population, where they could hide among the common people, and where they would not be found by the forces that were looking for them, and from where they mounted their guerrilla campaign against them. And so they knew exactly what they were doing in precisely these rural districts, and because they were being ignored, the fact they were making gains was not taken seriously. And indeed, it was the fact that they didn't take any major cities until much later in their campaign that played precisely into their hands in what they were trying to achieve, because it was in the rural districts that they were able to get money, they were able to tax the local population and utilize the poppy seeds for earning an income from the drug market, as well as gaining the supplies and the food they needed, whilst at the same time depriving the Afghan army of these resources that gave them the edge. Furthermore, it was in these areas that they were able to bring over the local population to their side, as they had been active in these rural areas for a long time. By bringing tribal elders onto their side, the Taliban are able to more effectively cut off these outposts of the Afghan National Army, who, due to the failures with the Afghan National Air Force, are not being able to be resupplied by air when the Taliban were surrounding and cutting off these various outposts in the more remote districts, which is what they repeatedly did early on in the campaign. And this led to so many of them surrendering, as the Afghan National Army forces didn't see any way that they would be resupplied and reinforced from Kabul. And with each surrender, the Taliban gained more armored vehicles like the American Humvees and more high-tech weaponry that the Afghan National Army had surrendered to them. But much more important than the equipment and the weapons that they captured was what they captured with the phones in their pockets, because the Taliban are no longer simply the bearded, turban-wearing Osama bin Laden helping fiends from the 1990s, because now almost every Taliban fighter also has a smartphone in his pocket, and with these they took videos every time that they would capture an Afghan National Army outpost, and these videos circulated so much on Afghan social media that other soldiers would see them and would believe that the war had been lost, that there were so many soldiers surrendering. Well, it must mean that the Taliban were incredibly powerful and they weren't able to fight back. But also the Taliban were very clever, and while there have been some instances, especially of the more elite commando units and commanders being executed after surrender, that in the videos they show them embracing and kissing one another and giving off the impression that if they simply surrendered, then they and their families would be fine. And this came at the same time as a wave of assassinations of Air Force pilots and other commanders and threats to families of higher ups in the army that the Taliban were making. And so many Afghan soldiers, because of seeing these videos, got the impression that the war was going far worse than it actually was. And this had the rippling effect that the more of these places were taken and the more videos the Taliban were taking of these surrenders that seemingly were peaceful, even jovial looking, with a lot of sheepish laughs from the Afghan troops that are surrendering and seeming camaraderie between them, the more frequently that other Afghan army outposts would simply surrender without firing a single shot because they thought it was their best bet. They, of course, hadn't been paid for many months, and they didn't really want to die for a state that they didn't really believe in. And I think this is why you see this cascading effect of these outer regions being captured, and then suddenly in August, when the offensive has been underway for a little time, this sense of defeat has just set in. And it's quite possible that this sense that the Taliban was sweeping to victory was also felt among many of the common rural people who maybe just wanted the war to stop. It's also possible to gain an understanding of the broader strategy of the Afghanistan when looking at a map of where its major cities are and where the Taliban made its gains during the offensive. Now, as I mentioned previously, they didn't immediately start attacking the larger cities because they were walking a fine tightrope between advancing enough in their offensive to put pressure on the Afghan government, but not doing anything so much so that it might draw the Americans back into the conflict, which didn't occur. And this is very clear to the Taliban because Biden continued with the plan to pull out, despite the fact that the Taliban were clearly not keeping their side of the agreement that had been reached in Doha in scaling back their attacks. What appears to happen is that the Taliban focused on attacking rural areas surrounding major cities, and this is a development that is clear by the start of August. And while Herat and Lashkargah and Kandahar and Kunduz and Mazar-i-Sharif are all surrounded by districts controlled by the Taliban, they hadn't actually yet entered these cities. They were just completely surrounded by those areas that had been captured by the Taliban. What becomes clearer when we look is that a key moment in the Taliban offensive is the early on capture of this district to the north of Kabul, because this is where the main and only real highway goes between Kabul and the various cities to the north of Kunduz, Mazar-i-Sharif, as well as to the west in Herat. And the Taliban captured it very early on, and this meant that the Afghan government were not able to send reinforcements over land to these various places because of the Taliban capture. And we've already talked about how poor the Air Force was faring at the time, and so the Taliban effectively cut off Kabul from the north from important resources, as well as those northern cities from the military in Kabul itself. We also see that the Taliban very strategically focused on gaining access to the most important border crossings with the neighbouring countries. This further served to cut off parts of the country from being resupplied from the neighbouring states themselves, as these points that are highlighted are where the major highways connect Afghanistan to its neighbours. And the Taliban capturing this severely crippled the movement of the Afghan army inside the country, as well as trade and the financial aid it might otherwise have received from the countries around it. And there were actually reports from several Afghan soldiers that some of the Taliban that they fought against were heard speaking different foreign languages. Now, I wasn't able to find which precise languages these were, but it wouldn't surprise me if these were Central Asian people from some of the countries that surround Afghanistan and have been involved in other Islamist movements that came over from their side of the border to support the Taliban. And so it may be the case that these border districts didn't only fall on the Afghan side, but that they were aided from the other side by non-state actors as well. A final interesting point that I want to touch on is that they focused their attention on gaining land in the north. And this was particularly surprising and caught the Afghan government off guard, because this region that is circled was the part of Afghanistan that in the 90s didn't fall to the Taliban and continued to resist under the Northern Alliance. But this time around it fell fairly easily to the Taliban, despite historically having been a bastion of anti-Taliban sentient. So it may be the case that there is some underhand politics going on, either that or that the warlords were significantly weakened in this area after Ashraf Ghani's government, or that there is indeed something more to the story that we don't yet know. Thank you all very much for tuning in to watch this video on what has recently happened in Afghanistan, the Taliban takeover, and some of the reasons why I think that it went the way that it did and why it caught quite a few people by surprise. Let me know if you agreed with this analysis, and if you have more information on what occurred on the ground, then I would be all ears and would find it really interesting to find out about that. I think I will be covering a few more things, such as this new Panjshir resistance that has sprung up and what that means, what their chances are, and how that has come about in the future, as well as some other things about the new foreign policy of Afghanistan under the Taliban themselves. But thank you very much for watching. Do check out Ground News, because it's a really cool sponsor and they were really helpful for making this video, and I will see you all the next time. In the meantime, this has been the rather recent and rather unfortunate history, and I have been Hilbert.